Tuesday, September 25th. A call to give civilians powerful oversight of the Chicago Police Department. The author of a new book on why he thinks America's foreign policy that is, has been wrong for years. Lawmakers hope to enlist ethical hackers to find bugs in U.S. government networks.
Welcome, my fellow citizens, to the Citizen Kelly Show. I am Citizen Kelly.
There is one self-identified Republican in the growing field of candidates to be Chicago mayor. We hear his plans for the city.
Come fly with me, we'll fly away.
And soaring high with a widely acclaimed Chicago jazz singer on the comeback trail. All that and more next on Chicago Tonight. Thanks for joining us. I'm Phil Ponce. Day 6 of testimony in the Jason Van Dyke trial. Brandis Friedman has that story and more of what's making news in Chicago tonight. Brandis.
And Phil, today in court, defense attorneys representing Chicago cop Jason Van Dyke tried to make the case that Laquan McDonald was getting closer to the officer when the shooting happened back in October 2014. Jurors heard testimony from a California-based company called 3D Forensics, which created an animation of the moments leading up to the shooting using laser scanning and drone images, as well as that infamous police dashcam video. Company head Jason Freeze testified that the video shows McDonald looking at Officer Van Dyke while quickly moving towards him.
Our analysis demonstrates that Mr. McDonald was getting closer to Officer Van Dyke up until the time of the shooting.
The defense strategy so far has been to paint McDonald as a violent, aggressive teen, with his parole officer testifying today about a 2013 incident where McDonald had to be restrained while resisting being led from a courtroom. Today would have been McDonald's 21st birthday. Testimony resumes tomorrow. The Archdiocese of Chicago is paying almost $3 million to settle a case of alleged abuse at the hands of Father Daniel McCormick. An attorney for the victim, who is an unidentified man in his late 20s, announced the settlement today, just days before the civil trial was scheduled to begin. The attorney says the victim was sexually assaulted by McCormick twice during elementary school at St. Agatha's Catholic Church. The lawsuit claimed the Archdiocese acted willfully by ordaining the priest despite knowledge of other sexual abuse allegations. Tonight, the Archdiocese says it does not discuss settlements or pending cases out of respect for the privacy of plaintiffs. In total, it's paid approximately $200 million to abuse claimants. The field for Chicago mayor isn't settled, but the sniping is well underway. Businessman Willie Wilson is accusing Cook County Board President Toni Preckwinkle of misleading voters by bragging about her criminal justice record. Wilson claims he, not Preckwinkle, is responsible for getting state legislators to pass a law that limits the use of monetary bail for nonviolent offenders.
It's ironic that Toni Preckwinkle would take credit for anything as related to prison reform, for the simple fact didn't nothing happen until I spent the hundreds of thousands of dollars and made it public, went down to Springfield, hired a lobbyist as well to help get this thing done. And now she want to take credit for that.
Preckwinkle touted criminal justice reform as a top achievement when she announced her run for mayor last week. Allies credit Preckwinkle with helping to reduce Cook County's jail population by 30% over the course of her term. They say when the law passed, Cook County was already taking steps to deal with suspects who couldn't afford bond. And the Chicago cast of Hamilton is encouraging voters to rise up.
We can go on Twitter, we can go on Facebook, Instagram, and say our piece. The best thing we can do is vote and to try to change and make a difference. So it's important for us to relay the message that we're giving every night to hear in the real world, to say this is how you can rise up and this is how you can make your voices heard and force some change. That's what you want.
And that's Chicago's own A.Ham actor Miguel Cervantes. He and other cast members joined Cook County Clerk David Orr at the CIBC Theater in the Loop, where the musical plays. They help folks register to vote as part of National Voter Registration Day. The clerk's office says events like this one today registered more than 1,700 people. As for the weather, a severe thunderstorm watch is in effect until 10 o'clock tonight, then breezy with a chance of showers and thunderstorms and a low around 50. Then tomorrow, mostly sunny but cooler with a high near 65. Now, Phil, back to you.
Thank you, Brandis. And don't forget, you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook via podcast and the PBS video app, as well as online at WTTW.com/news. And now to Eddie Aruza and one group's push for powerful civilian oversight of the Chicago Police Department. Eddie.
Phil, the Grassroots Alliance for Police Accountability, or GAPA, wants a 7-member civilian board with, among other things, the power to hire and fire the police superintendent and have final say on policing matters. GAPA presented a report to that effect 6 months ago and found city council allies who are trying to make it ordinance. But now with Mayor Emanuel leaving office in 9 months, some fear his promise to include civilians in police oversight might go unfulfilled. Well, joining us tonight to talk more about this are Autry Phillips, Executive Director of Target Area Development Corporation. That's a grassroots social justice organization which is a member of GAPA. Adam Gross, an attorney with BPI, a public policy center, and Mr. Gross provides legal and policy support to GAPA. And Richard Wooten, a retired Chicago police officer and founder and president of Gathering Point Community Council, a nonprofit community empowerment organization. We invited members of the City Council, the police department, and the police union to join us, but they declined or were unavailable. But we thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you for having us.
So, Autry Phillips, why should a civilian board have these kinds of sweeping powers?
One reason is that the community is asking for it. It's something that the relationships between the community and the police are so fragile. What we're trying to do is bring unity into the communities again.
But why not have more input, not just give them the sole power to hire and fire the police superintendent and decide on policy matters and policing strategies?
Well, that's a good question. But I think the better question is, what is it that the community want? The community is asking for something that I believe that our mayor and our police can actually give. It's not often that the community actually asks for anything. And with all the shootings that has been going on in our city over the years, now we have a voice. And that's one thing that GAPA is trying to do, is give our community a voice.
Adam Gross, now that the mayor has essentially signed off on the consent decree, he's also more or less washed his hands of this. He says it's completely up to the city council to decide where to move, how to move forward on a civilian oversight board. Where does it stand right now in the city council?
The GAPA proposal has 23 supporters in the city council, and we're hopeful that as we move towards an election is a time to reflect, to think about the city's future, to think about where we want to be, to think about where what we need to do to get where we want to get. And we're finding now increasingly, as we speak with members of the city council, we're getting more and more support for the proposal. So we're optimistic that we'll get there.
But GAPA is pushing for this to happen before Mayor Emanuel leaves office. If he's leaving it up to the city council, why do you need it to happen before he leaves office?
We think police reform has been a long time coming. The city's made a strong commitment to it. The Police Accountability Task Force had 3 big recommendations for structural reform of the police oversight system. 2 of those recommendations have been implemented. The final recommendation is about civilian oversight. We think it is the responsibility of this administration and this city council to make good on that promise.
Richard Wooten, you know the key essentials of this proposal.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on it?
You know, I think that we're on the right track, but I think we're moving a little bit too fast. We're moving too fast in a way that when the task force, when we put that information out there, we wanted to actually make sure that we had some type of oversight that was actually ran by civilians. We didn't want to take over. We didn't want to actually shift the power from them, but we wanted to have a balanced system.
Let me clarify something, because you weren't on the task force, the leadership or the main task force. You were a part of a working group, isn't that right?
A working group, right, the police and community relations.
Okay, so when you were part of that group, you made
force.
some of the recommendations about
Yes.
a community oversight board.
One of the main recommendations is that we maintain a balance between the politics as well as community. And community had to have a frank input on policies and procedures that was actually part of the Chicago Police Department, but it wasn't at the tune of where they would take total control of it. I think that when we take total control from the police department, from those professions, from those people with the experience, and we just totally bring it into the hands of just civilians who have no knowledge or no understanding of the operations, then we set ourselves up for failure. Now, what we're doing right here with GAPA is actually moving in the right direction. We are moving in the right direction because we are taking and maintaining oversight, or actually establishing oversight, but we're establishing oversight to where we can make recommendations and we can actually be in a position to where we can put our foot down on the hands of the individuals that make the decisions.
Audrey Phillips, as you know, both the police superintendent and the Fraternal Order of Police are strongly against this proposal. In fact, the superintendent has said that civilians don't have the professional acumen to develop strategy. And again, getting back to that hiring and firing, it could happen if they disagree with some sort of call that whatever police superintendent is there. It could be arbitrary, it could be haphazard. So again, how do you react to these accusations coming from both the FOP and the police superintendent?
One thing that we want to look at is that we want to build the trust back in communities. We want to be able to have mom that's sitting on the corner or sitting on her porch, we have the ability to sit there and trust the fact that if something happens, that if something happens to her or her children, that somebody will be accountable for what happened to them.
I think it's important to be clear about what the GAPA proposal is with regard to policy making. It's based on a system that they've had in place in the city of Los Angeles for almost 100 years, where a civilian board has full authority to make policy for the police department. They do that in close collaboration with the police department. The goal isn't to put policies in place over the objection of the police department. It's to build consensus. And that's critically important for all kinds of reasons. I'll give you one specific example. Around the city of Chicago, we have more than 10,000 cameras out on the street. Those cameras have the ability to zoom in to our homes. Right now, policy about how those cameras should be used is entirely in the hands of the police department. There is no public input into that process. Those cameras can be a terrific crime-fighting tool, but they also raise all kinds of concerns about privacy. Those are the sorts of things typically that we debate as a city, and the final decision about how to weigh the costs and benefits, about how best to put the most appropriate safeguards in place for a system like that, we think is appropriately in the hands of a more public body.
You also looked at Seattle. You formulated this plan based on the LA model and the Seattle model. Do they both have these kinds of powers where they can fire and hire the police chief in those cities?
Not in Seattle and in LA County. Our proposal is based more on the approach in the city of Los Angeles, where they have all of those powers.
You know, let me say this. You know, and again, you know, I agree with civilians having actually a supporting hand in policy and procedures. But when we talk about the hiring and the firing of a superintendent, you know, that's a little bit, you know, kind of like a very bad situation.
But
because
the accountability
but
of that,
we can hold the superintendent accountable, and we can hold his firing accountable to the mayor and city council by way of actually making sure that we have a system in place in tiers to where the mayor can't fire a superintendent without the blessings of the GAPA coalition. Okay? Now, if you do that, then you put the power base back in the hands of the people, because now the mayor is not going to be able to actually use this superintendent as a scapegoat.
Where do you reach a balance, though, Richard Wooten? Because right now there are some sort of civilian groups. There's COPA, has the word civilian in it, but they don't have the ability to do anything but advise. And so where do you reach a balance where the community can hold the leaders accountable and force their hand if necessary?
Well, I mean, this is actually the direction that we're heading in. So GAPA is headed in the right direction. I think that, you know, we just got to be very careful of how fast we move, because we can actually ultimately, you know, find ourselves in a position, especially actually allowing politics to become a part of this here right now, especially in this election season. We got to be very careful how we move this. We're talking about, okay, why isn't the mayor actually moving on this right now? Well, if you see some of the headlines in the paper where some of these aldermen are talking about a weak mayor, strong city council, they're trying to build up their base right now, and they want to use this as a tool. And I don't want this to become a tool for them to use in an election cycle.
Autry Phillips, there are 3 other plans. 2 of them were proposed by Alderman Reboiras, who we invited to be here tonight, Ariel Reboiras. And they're much weaker versions of this, obviously. Was this done on purpose, do you think, to try to prevent your plan from going forward?
Well, I can't speak for why those ordinances were put in place, but what we can speak to is the fact that they felt strong enough that our ordinance was a very strong ordinance, and they had to come out, and they meaning the city of Chicago had to come out with an ordinance. Again, I can't speak to why they did it, but I can speak to the fact that our ordinance is so strong and that it is led by the community. And I keep talking community because I believe that that's one piece that's missing, is that the community is asking for this. We have elected officials that are elected by the community. If the community is asking for something, we should at least listen to them.
Adam Gross, you said that you have 23 aldermen on board here, and maybe you will get a majority at some point soon, but there's still the fact that it can be held up in committee, and the mayor is still around for 9 months, so even though he's said it's up to the city council, he could still veto this and it'd become tougher to pass. What, if anything, are you willing to give in on this plan, if necessary?
We have some very clear principles that we've stated explicitly and we discuss regularly with aldermen. We need a proposal that is going to make the city safer. That's the bottom line here. And we need a system that is going to work to build trust. Trust between the police department and the communities they serve.
So would you give in on something like having the ultimate power of hiring and firing the superintendent, or having the last word on strategies and policies?
If there is a solution that is going to work to make us safer, that is going to build trust, that is going to create a significant role for civilians in setting policy, in the selection of key leadership, in setting goals for the police department, if it's going to create the foundation for a better working relationship between police officers and the communities they serve, we're open to discussion.
So there's room for negotiation. Richard Wooten, I'm going to have you give the last word because we're almost out of time, but could you give me some idea what you think is going through the mind of rank and file, which already feels that they're under assault with this consent decree, with body cam video being released quickly, and now the possibility of a civilian board having say in how they police?
Well, you know, I mean, at this point in time, as we mentioned earlier, you know, you got COPA dealing with the police department, you got the consent decree just dealing with the police department, you have the body cams. You know, the police department has a very big, you know, focus on them right now. And I think the last thing that they want to do at this moment is try to bring in some additional oversight on them, but it must be done. I guarantee you, it must be done. But I'm saying that if we're going to move GAPA, let's move it in a way where it's going to be streamlined appropriately and with the right people attached to it.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Autry Phillips, Adam Gross, and Richard Wooten, thank you very much for being here tonight.
Thank you.
And there's much more Chicago Tonight ahead, so stay with us.
This evening's presentation of Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by ComEd, powering lives.
There's a shortage of Latinos in STEM because there aren't enough opportunities. ComEd wants to change that, one program at a time. Celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month with Solar Spotlight. Building confidence, building bright minds, building the workforce of the future.
The end of the Cold War enabled American foreign policy to focus even more on spreading liberal values to the rest of the world, values such as human rights and a free market economy. But a local scholar argues that kind of foreign policy is doomed to fail if it hasn't already. The argument takes center stage in the new book, The Great Delusion, Liberal Dreams and International Realities. And joining us is the author, John Mearsheimer. He's a professor of political science and co-director of the program on international security at the University of Chicago. And John Mearsheimer, welcome back to Chicago Tonight.
I'm glad to be here, Phil.
What is the great delusion that America is suffering from?
Well, the great delusion is that the United States thought, starting in the early 1990s, that it would be easy to remake the world in America's image. And of course, we believed that if we could do that, it would be a more peaceful world and it would be a safer world for individuals all over the planet.
What characteristics of America are you arguing that this country attempted to export?
Well, the main thing that we were interested in exporting was our political system, liberal democracy. And the most important feature of liberal democracy that we cared about was individual rights. Americans tend to believe, because they're so profoundly liberal, and this includes people who we normally call conservatives and liberals, all of them are liberal Democrats at heart who believe in individual rights. And they believe that if you spread individual rights all across the planet, number one, it will lead to a more peaceful world, because if you have a world where everybody looks like the United States, by definition, it can't help but be more peaceful. Furthermore, you'll end up protecting the individual rights of people all over the world, because you won't have any more authoritarian regimes. You'll just have liberal democracies, and we all know liberal democracies protect individual rights.
So that was the theory. It sounds good on paper, but you say it has backfired. What do you mean?
Well, all you have to do is look at what happened in the Middle East, where we tried to employ the Bush Doctrine, which was all about toppling authoritarian regimes like Saddam Hussein, Assad in Syria, Colonel Gaddafi in Libya, and turning those countries into liberal democracy. We have failed at almost every turn. We have contributed to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people in the Middle East. The idea that this has been a successful enterprise is not a serious argument. And indeed, Phil, I would argue that one of the principal reasons that Donald Trump is in the White House is that he ran against liberal hegemony, and most Americans are fed up with American foreign policy and see it as a series of big failures.
One of the things you point out is that your belief that the spread of liberal democracy is at a profound disadvantage when it confronts nationalism. Expand on that.
Nationalism is the most powerful political ideology on the planet. It's much more powerful than liberalism. Liberalism is based on individuals. It's individual rights. Nationalism assumes that we're all very tribal, that we belong to groups. And the fact of the matter is that we are very tribal. Let me give you a good example. Madeleine Albright is very famous for saying, "We are the indispensable nation. We stand taller and we see further." Now, Madeleine Albright is a canonical liberal. But if you think about what she's saying in what is probably the most famous statement she ever made, it's nationalism to the core. We, as opposed to the other, we are the indispensable nation. See that word nation? As in nationalism. We are better than others. We stand taller. We see further. This is what nationalism is all about. And it's very different than individualism, which is at the heart of liberalism.
Because one of the points that, following up on that, one of the points you make in your book is that nationalism is sort of a much more visceral kind of feeling than liberalism in the way you're talking, which is more ideological or theoretical. Is that how you'd put it?
Oh, there's no question about it. That nationalism, it's very emotional. Nationalism is a lot like patriotism. For scholars, it's oftentimes very difficult to distinguish between nationalism on one hand and patriotism on the other hand. But if you think about what patriotism was all about, it's love of the country, love of the flag. And with liberalism, it's a much more cold and calculating ideology. Now, I don't want to disparage liberalism too much, because as I say in the book, I'm profoundly thankful that I was born in liberal America and that I grew up in liberal America. I think the best possible political system you can have is a liberal democracy. But my argument is that liberal democracy at home is one thing, but when you try and export liberal democracy to other countries, you run into forces like nationalism.
Speaking of nationalism, do you believe that some countries are either historically or culturally predisposed to strong man nationalism?
I think that every country is predisposed to nationalism because we are social animals from the get-go. We form into groups. Those groups we now call nations, and this is why the world is filled with nation states. I think at the same time, all of these nations or nation states have very different experiences, and those experiences sometimes lead those nation states to be liberal nation states, and in other cases, authoritarian ones. And I think one of the great benefits of living in the United States is that because of the circumstances in which we as a country grew up, we turned out to be a liberal democracy.
You write that what you support is a policy that you refer to as realism. What does that mean?
Well, I'm interested in a policy that pays attention to the balance of power. I think the balance of power in the world really matters. When I see a rising China on the horizon, I worry about that country because it may end up being more powerful than the United States. But I'm also not interested in running all over the world, interfering in the politics of other countries. One of the few things that I agree with Donald Trump about, and he was talking about this today, was the importance of sovereignty. Sovereignty means that you respect the rights of other countries to decide what kind of political system they will have. And we should not, therefore, interfere in their politics, just the way the vast majority of Americans don't want the Russians or any other country interfering in our politics. That's what sovereignty is all about.
Speaking of Donald Trump, we have a clip of part of his address at the United Nations, and let's take a look.
I honor the right of every nation in this room to pursue its own customs, beliefs, and traditions. The United States will not tell you how to live or work or worship. We only ask that you honor our sovereignty in return.
That's the phrase you were alluding to earlier in the in this bigger picture question. Earlier in the speech, he asserted that the United States, under his administration, had done more, had accomplished more in 2 years than practically any other administration, and he was met with laughter. How would you describe how the United States is perceived in terms of its foreign policy around the world?
Well, I think that the United States is perceived as remarkably foolish at this point in time by almost all of our allies. This is certainly true in Europe. If you go to Europe today, or you go to countries like Japan and South Korea, people just roll their eyes when you talk about President Trump. And with regard to our potential adversaries, countries like Russia and China, they all believe that he is unnecessarily hostile toward them and that he should place much more emphasis on cooperation than on conflict.
One of the things you point out in your book, it's a central argument, and quickly, has to do with your assertion that liberal democracies tend to become militaristic, at least the United States have. Why does that happen?
Well, it's because liberal democracies are interested in spreading that particular political ideology all over the planet. There are no priorities when you have a foreign policy of liberal hegemony. Every nook and cranny of the world matters, and what you want to do is spread liberal democracy everywhere. And you are willing to do it using military force. So the United States is today a country that is addicted to war. We have been at war for 2 out of every 3 years since the Cold War ended. We have fought 7 separate wars. This is a highly militaristic country.
What do you want people to take away from your book?
I think that what they should understand is that the foreign policy that we have pursued since the Cold War ended in 1989 has been boneheaded. It's got us into a lot of trouble. A lot of Americans have died. A lot more people in other countries have died. We've spent trillions and trillions of dollars, and it would make much more sense for the United States to pursue a more restrained foreign policy and not being interfering in the politics of every country around the world. As President Trump said, we should respect the sovereignty of other countries, and we should expect them to respect our sovereignty.
John Mearsheimer, that's where we'll have to leave it. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, Phil.
Again, the book is called The Great Delusion, Liberal Dreams, and International Realities. You can read an excerpt on our website. Still to come on Chicago Tonight, should ethical hackers be allowed to find weaknesses in the U.S. government's own technical infrastructure? Chicago Talk Radio host Bill Kelly is one Republican in the nonpartisan race for mayor. He says he can win without a runoff. And a Chicago jazz singer prepares his comeback after a serious health scare. But first, we're going to take a short break to ask you for your support of this program and tell you how you can get tickets to a very special Chicago Tonight event. Here is Amanda Vinicky.
Hello, Chicago Tonight viewers. I'm Amanda Vinicky, and I cover how our state is governed. My job is to tell you who and what is behind the decisions and laws that affect your life. It doesn't get any better than that. Why aren't you part of these meetings? You're the governor.
Well, so I've talked to...
When I joined Chicago Tonight a few years ago, I knew I was joining one of the best teams of journalists around, both on TV and online. We cover stories from all sides, everything from the complex world of Springfield to the more personal stories that connect us all. No other Chicago television station provides that in-depth storytelling, and you won't find this kind of local coverage in other cities. Chicago Tonight is unique. You know that independent, unbiased journalism is more important now than ever before. On Friday, October 19th, join me and my Chicago Tonight colleagues for a fun, behind-the-scenes look at the coming elections. We will explore the campaigns and the candidates in a freewheeling discussion, and you can join in the conversation as well. Here's how.
For a donation of $100, you will receive a ticket to this event at the WTTW Studios in Chicago. Please go online now at WTTW.com/news or call 773-588-1111 to sign up. Any amount helps keep Chicago Tonight strong, but if you contribute $100, you will receive a ticket to this unique event. Tickets are limited, so don't miss this opportunity. Again, it's Friday, October 19th at our WTTW Studios.
For more than 30 years, Chicago Tonight has connected you to your community. You can trust us to bring you in-depth, unbiased coverage of the stories you care about most, and we can only do it with your help.
So please go online now at WTTW.com or call 773-588-1111 to reserve a seat at $100 each for our Chicago Tonight behind-the-scenes look at the coming election. You can join in the conversation and meet the whole Chicago Tonight team.
Thank you for your support of Chicago Tonight. We look forward to seeing you here in October.
In an age when the internet represents a new international battlefield, the U.S. government is updating its cyber warfare strategies. Last week, the Department of Defense released a cybersecurity plan to preemptively attack foreign hackers before they reach U.S. networks. A separate White House plan released days later stresses the importance of collaborating with academics and the private tech sector to ward off bad actors on the web. Joining us now is Teresa Payton, who served as the White House's Chief Information Officer from 2006 to 2008 and is currently CEO of the cybersecurity company Fortalice Solutions. She is in town for the Cybersecurity Chicago event at McCormick Place this week, and thank you for joining us. First of all, what were your responsibilities at the White House as the Chief Information Officer?
Sure. The Chief Information Officer takes care of the 3,000 staff, the President and the Vice President, that serve at the Executive Office of the President. Our goal is to make sure that no matter where the staff is in the world, that we extend the technology to them as if they were still sitting at their desk in Washington, D.C., make it easy for them to do their jobs, and oh, by the way, make it secure.
Well, what do you make, as someone who's concerned about security, what do you make of the Pentagon cybersecurity plan to, quote, defend forward? Is that too aggressive, as some people are saying?
Well, I think what everybody has to realize is as the technology evolves every year, our adversaries' tactics are evolving every year, and so it's a good idea to sort of look at our strategy and say whether or not we have enough of an aggressive offensive strategy. So part of this could be making sure the rest of the world knows that we are going to build out an offensive capability, so if you strike us, we may strike back, and in certain cases we may make some decisions to take an offensive strike. Word of caution though, attribution in that moment is so hard to do. You don't want to make sure, you want to make sure that you're not accidentally impacting civilians. So when you think about, for decades, even centuries, we have thought about physical war and not impacting civilians. In cyberspace, we've got the same issue to be thinking about. You don't want to take civilian systems offline while you're going on offense.
Give me an example of what a preemptive strike might look like. What would it do?
Well, for example, one of the things, and I'm just making up a hypothetical here, but one of the things we could be looking at is, okay, as we're going into the next election cycle, maybe we see chatter on some different dark web chat rooms where we see state-sponsored actors talking about interfering and meddling on social media in the elections. You could potentially then, on an offensive level, decide if you wanted to take military action with that. You could do a couple of different things. Maybe you could
You mean military hacking? You don't mean hacking on the part of the military, or do you mean actual deployment of military forces?
It could be, I think what the Department of Defense is trying to do is make cyber one element that they could take versus moving tanks, guns, and ships. So it gives them that opportunity. It's just another area where they can leverage that as a tool in their toolkit.
You touched on this just a minute ago, but what are the potential downsides, or what are the potential pitfalls of being more aggressive in regards to cybersecurity? For example, the Obama administration was criticized as being too timid regarding cybersecurity. Number one, was it?
No, I think the way I look at how each administration has evolved, from Bush to Obama and now the Trump administration, is you have really talented people supporting all three administrations who are really studying these issues, both at the Department of Defense, the White House, and also the private sector advises the White House on what the capabilities are that they're seeing attacking their businesses. And what I really see is, can an administration do more? Yes, I wish they would do more, but they've got other priorities on their plate. It's not just about cybersecurity. There's other things they're thinking about. But as you look at sort of this evolution of the United States and the stand that they're taking, again, my word of caution would be around attribution. It's so hard to do in that moment.
By attribution, what do you mean?
So, for example,
like who started it?
Yeah, like who started it? Who's actually directing the activity? We're seeing where maybe a state-sponsored, government employee by day in another country such as Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran could be moonlighting on their own, or could be collaborating with cybercriminal syndicates on their own. So it may or may not be directed by the government. And taking that offensive strike, they're very good at hiding behind unwitting citizens' computers that are unpatched. They could be attacking, you could be attacking somebody's grandmom's computer that she's using to stay in touch with the kids on Facebook.
Some lawmakers, as you know, want the ethical hackers to attack the Department of Homeland Security system in order to see what the vulnerabilities might be. Is that a good idea?
If you have the right rules of engagement and you invite the right resources to the table, I think this is a great intersection of private sector, public sector. You could take sort of the best and brightest minds from the academic community, from the ethical hacking community, and again, you need the right rules of engagement. What you don't want them to do is say publicly what all the findings were if we don't have the time and the means to fix all of the issues that were found by this group. But with the right rules of engagement, I think that's the type of very dynamic and innovative area that we need to play in, which is that sharing of public-private sector knowledge.
One of the things that we've heard about so much and continue to hear about is what the Russians did in the last election. That's a very high-profile kind of topic. But what happens on a day-to-day basis in this world? What goes on?
From a cybersecurity perspective,
yes.
What we're seeing is you have independent cybercriminal syndicates across different countries. They're not state-sponsored. They're just opportunists looking for perpetrating frauds and scams. I live in North Carolina. We've seen different groups come up with fake websites, fake charities, trying to trick people out of their hard-earned money, thinking they're donating it to Hurricane Florence victims, but they're not. They're lining the pockets of cybercriminals. But we're also seeing state-sponsored activity continue to amp up. And it's not just Russia. For example, Iran has just been found to be creating what looks like American profiles They're using the hashtag Make America Great Again, and they're criticizing Indians for taking high-tech jobs away from Americans. They're Iranians who are waiting in line for HB1 visas, who are jealous and thinking that maybe Indians are going to take their place in line. So you're seeing this manipulation happening across the globe. This playbook has been perfected by Russia, and it's not just going to stop at elections. It's going to be all kinds of social issues in America and among our allies.
You say it's not just elections. What are the other kinds of cybersecurity threats that the average American citizen might be subject to, or be part of some collateral damage of a cyber attack?
I mean, I think a lot of people are still trying to understand the data that was taken from Equifax and what that could mean from them. We know
And
that,
remind people what that was?
yes, sir, the Equifax data breach, one of the largest data breaches hitting U.S. citizens and some UK and Canadian citizens. It was your credit report data, things like the last places you've lived, your credit score, your mother's maiden name, your social security number, and that kind of information floating out there in the wrong hands. They can play the long game. You're not going to get a new social security number, and so if they want to wait 3 to 4 years, that can be an issue. But thankfully, you can get free credit report monitoring for life. You now have that opportunity, and you can freeze your credit if you want to, and you can get that free credit report monitoring. Some of the other things that we're seeing is people hacking in and taking over your social media accounts, your devices, your Internet of Things, so that they can use the camera, use the audio, the same way as if they owned it and they were there. So there's different types of things, but the good news is if you take a few simple steps. So for example, consider freezing your credit permanently and only lifting it when you need it. Think about having more than one email address that you use for different parts of your life. Have an email address for your personal bank account and your health insurance that you don't use anywhere else. And so that way, if it is in another data breach, you've got a single purpose email that's being used. Don't hand out your real cell phone number online. Get a burner number like a Google Voice account or a Talkatone account and forward that to your real cell phone number. So there's a lot of different things that you can do that doesn't require being a technical engineer to be able to set it up.
Last question. Tell us about the event you're speaking at tomorrow, Cybersecurity Chicago. What's your message?
Sure. I can't wait for the event. We're going to be talking about how we need to integrate these newer technologies and how to safeguard what matters most. There's going to be over 3,000 people there. The public is invited to come. You just have to go online and get tickets.
Teresa Payton, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks
we appreciate
for having
it.
me.
And back in just a moment with another candidate for Chicago mayor.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by the Inland Real Estate Group of Companies.
The Inland Real Estate Group of Companies is a national financial and commercial real estate group. Always building for tomorrow, Inland has conducted over $44 billion in commercial property transactions over the last 50 years. Inland owns, manages, finances, and invests in major retail shopping centers, apartments, large-scale construction projects, student housing, and medical office and healthcare facilities. The Inland Real Estate Group of Companies, Incorporated. Born in Chicago, at home in the world of commercial real estate since 1968. To learn more, visit inlandgroup.com.
The last time Chicago had a Republican mayor was 1931 when Big Bill Thompson left office. Our next guest says he wants to end that drought. He is the one Republican among the roughly 16 candidates who want to succeed Rahm Emanuel in what is a nonpartisan election in February. Bill Kelly said he was going to run for governor this year, then he did not. In 2014, he donated $100,000 to his own campaign for mayor, busting spending limits, then didn't end up running. He did run for Illinois Comptroller in the 2010 Republican primary. Kelly is the host of Citizen Kelly. That's a talk radio show on WCGO AM. Bill Kelly, welcome back to Chicago Tonight.
Thank you for having me, Phil.
First of all, basic question, what qualifies you to be mayor of Chicago? You look at Toni Preckwinkle and her experience, you see Bill Daley, you see Paul
I have the
Vallis.
most important qualification of them all, Phil. And first of all, thank you for having me. I truly appreciate it. I was born and raised in Chicago. I love Chicago with all of my heart. I was raised to believe that Chicago is the greatest city in the history of the world.
Lots of people have those three characteristics. What
And I was
qualifies you to be
raised to
mayor?
believe that being mayor of the Chicago is the most important job in the world. And I am the only Republican running against 2 or 3 dozen Democrats on the same ballot, by the way. Very important point that you just made. I hear them talking about how much they hate Trump, they hate the police, or some combination of those two things. I'm the only candidate talking about how much I love Chicago.
Well, beyond your love for Chicago,
all day, every day.
What is it that qualifies you to be mayor of the city you love so much?
Well, I've spent my entire life in the city. I was born and raised in the 19th Ward, Southwest Side. A lot of police and fire and Chicago public school teachers. Both my parents were Chicago public school teachers, and I'd like to really get to that issue in a second. But I also was raised in that community, a very unique community, to believe in God, to believe in patriotism, to believe in law and order. Three things that will get you disinvited to a lot of candidate events in the city of Chicago.
Those are qualities,
yes,
and admirable qualities, but in terms of experience.
Right. I currently live in the 42nd Ward, downtown, Gold Coast, whatever you want to call it. I went to school there, Loyola University. I started my business there. Today it's an Emmy Award-winning TV production company, Phil. I've pulled in millions of dollars. I'm the CFO of my own business, obviously. And one of the interesting things that I've done with that company is I've produced essentially very Chicago-centric TV programs. Upscale Chicago, ran on local Fox for 5 years. Comcast, I was on Sportsaholic and Comcast Sportsnet for a couple of years. These shows brought me all around Chicago, to every square inch of Chicago, and I got to meet people. I got to hear their issues, and I believe that I know Chicago, and that I know what the real people of Chicago care about. And we worked very, very closely with Governor Pat Quinn, for example, a Democrat, who I have a great admiration for, a reformer, on the term limit the mayor referendum. We devoted an hour a night on my radio show, the Citizen Kelly Show, to the term limit the mayor petition drive.
So that was an advocacy thing.
Yes.
Well, look, we couldn't really find any position papers on your website. You directed our producer to your Washington Times opinion piece for your positions. But the article makes a lot of accusations against Mayor Emanuel and the media, but we couldn't find any positions of your own, so now's your chance. Violence, what would you do to make the streets safer?
Okay, well, the first thing we need to do to make the streets safer is for Rahm to resign. The fact that he's not running for re-election, supposedly that's some big accomplishment.
Why would that make the streets safer?
Until my job's not done until Rahm resigns. He's going to be mayor for another 9 months. His ACLU police chief is responsible for a 1 in 20 conviction rate on murders. Phil, we have hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of murders in the city of Chicago, shootings and murders.
How would you make things better?
How would I make things better? Yeah. First of all, as mayor of the city of Chicago, the first thing I would do is get up and tell the police that that they can take the handcuffs off themselves and feel free to put the handcuffs on violent offenders. And can I tell you something, Phil? The law-abiding citizens of the Chicago, the vast majority of the citizens of Chicago, will be happier as a result of that. We've got a couple of court dates coming up this week. We have, we hear a lot about Van Dyke. Thursday, we also have a court date for Paul Bauer, Commander Paul Bauer. He was shot and murdered directly across the street from City Hall. And he has a court date on Thursday. Why don't we have in fact, you know what? I'll put the information at williamjkelly.org. I would like to invite my fellow citizens to come out to Paul Bauer's court date on Thursday morning.
Let's talk about schools. What would you do to make Chicago schools better, improve education?
Both my parents were Chicago public school teachers. Education is very near and dear to my heart, Phil.
Well, so what would you do?
As I believe that it is to yours as well. And one of the main reason I believe that Rahm should resign today is, once again, forgive me, accusations. Hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of Chicago public school students have reported being sexually harassed, abused, and raped in the Chicago public school system. Now, these students have not...
You're referring to a Chicago Tribune report.
Exactly right.
But in the field,
this should be front page news. This should be the story that you cover every single day, Phil, if I may say, with all due respect, because I truly respect you and the job you do.
It's been covered. Bill, we're almost out of time, but
it's unfortunate.
Let's talk about some meat and potatoes things. You said that that you felt that you would win and that
Hands
a
down.
runoff was not necessary.
Exactly right. Can I tell you why, Phil?
Sure.
I'm running on the same ticket with 20+ Democrats. I'm the only Republican. Donald Trump, believe it or not, received 133,000 votes in the city of Chicago. If I get the Trump voters alone, who I guarantee you are not going to be voting for Tony Preckwinkle or Lori Lightfoot, and the Democrats divide their Democrat votes in their traditional identity voting, voting blocks, 5 ways to Sunday, 6 ways to Sunday, I will win this race walking away, Phil, and you will have a Mayor Kelly who will truly make it Chicago again.
And if that were to happen, we would want Mayor Kelly back.
Wonderful.
If that were to happen.
I
Kelly,
would be honored.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
One of Chicago's hottest singers is on the comeback trail. We caught up with Paul Marinaro at the Green Mill, accompanied by the Chicago Jazz Orchestra. The big band and the singer with the big voice brought a lot of volume and a story to tell.
Well, all right, okay.
On a summer evening in Uptown, a crowd gathers for the main event.
If I'm gonna be your man, sweet baby, won't you take my hand?
Paul Marinaro has a remarkable instrument. Just the warmth, the wide open quality. There's no strain when he sings. Music flows from him like water from a faucet. You combine that natural amber quality of his tone with the swing rhythm that he is so comfortable with, and the intelligence of the way he can interpret a ballad, and you have really the complete singer.
Why not call it a day in a sensible way?
I mostly work with small groups where there's just a lot more freedom on either end of a beat for me to play around with. So just singing with a big band in general, it's a different form of singing. It's a more controlled form of singing, and you really need to know the arrangements that you're singing with and kind of where to lay in the pocket of what's on either end of you.
Don't you worry about me.
Performing standards best known by the likes of Frank Sinatra and Nat King Cole doesn't bother the singer.
I think the best artists connect to these songs, to these lyrics, as an actor would the words in a play. They're going to find something different to interpret. They're going to respond emotionally in a different way.
You're the ghost of a romance in June.
Paul doesn't just sing. Paul thinks about what he's singing. He's a philosopher as well as a vocalist.
Ain't got no rest in my slumbers.
The Buffalo, New York native visited a friend in Chicago 16 years ago and stayed.
Get out of town.
But he almost checked out last year when he underwent emergency surgery for a life-threatening stomach ailment. After a follow-up operation, he's just now at full strength.
I was closer to the edge than I ever want to be again, and, for a long time anyway. And that definitely changes your perspective on a lot of things in life. But I had never been taken out of the game of music for as long, since I first started singing. You get caught in a trajectory. You get caught in the forward motion of your career and what you're trying to do, and you don't really think about how much time is passing. You just keep forging ahead. So to be pulled out of that and to have this complete stop in the middle of all that was really different for me. It was very challenging.
I've got the world on a string, sitting on a rainbow. Got the string around my little finger. What a world. Man, this is a life. Hey, now, I'm in love.
I've been very blessed with not only the musicians that I've been fortunate enough to work with here in Chicago, but the familiar faces, from my earliest barroom gigs when nobody knew who I was when I first got to Chicago until now. I have some of the same people that still, show up to just about everything.
Come fly with me, we'll fly away.
you have a singer who can pretty much do it all in the jazz realm. And a voice like that, and a talent like that, and a development of skill like that comes along very rarely. And here now in Chicago, that's Paul Marinaro.
Pack up, let's fly away. Thank you very much.
Paul Marinaro plays a series of comeback shows with a quartet at the Jazz Showcase this Thursday through Sunday. And the Chicago Jazz Orchestra is getting ready for their season opener next month. Find out more on both of them on our website. And that is our show for this Tuesday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing and join us tomorrow night live at 7. Beyond the Ferguson protests and the movement they sparked, meet activist DeRay McKesson. And a visit to the Bocce Club founded by Italian immigrants nearly 60 years ago. Here again is Paul Marinaro, accompanied by the Chicago Jazz Orchestra, performing The Lady is a Tramp and That Old Black Magic. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Phil Ponce, and I thank you for watching. Good night.
Life without care, she's broke, but it's okay. It's California, it's cold, it's down. Well, that's why the lady, that is why the lady, that's why the lady is a tramp. You're the mate, well, that fate had me created for. Every time your lips meet mine, darling, down and down.
Closed captioning for this program is brought to you by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, serving Chicago as a personal injury law firm since 1984.
Magic called love.